Have you ever wondered why someone with narcissistic traits or in a toxic relationship can't move past their belief that things will change? Is it possible to bridge the gap between their idealized world and the painful reality they try to avoid? Hello everyone, welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. In this episode, you're going to hear the final clip from an interview I did with Valerie Green on her podcast, Soul Shaking Love. During this segment of the interview, we dive into two more of the most common and important questions people ask when it comes to narcissism and narcissistic relationships. 1. How can you influence someone to get the help they seem to need? And 2, what psychological challenges do narcissists face when it comes to embracing change? And how does this relate to their inner world of fantasy? Valerie and I talk about how narcissists often live in, and I quote here, a fantasy world, and the tension between that and, again I quote, the real world. You'll hear how understanding this split is key to any chance for meaningful change and personal growth. I just wanted to quickly orient you before we jump into the interview. Valerie brings up, and I'm quoting, these 4 characteristics. You'll hear this as soon as we turn to the content. That is something that I mentioned earlier in the interview. The characteristics are crucial for change to happen in someone on the narcissistic spectrum. If you listen to the previous episode, we went into them in much more detail there, but here's a brief overview of those 4 key factors. If lasting and genuine change is to occur, the individual who's experiencing narcissistic traits must be able to demonstrate 1, an ability to acknowledge and take some responsibility for problems in oneself or the relationship. 2, they must have some capacity to tolerate painful feelings. Again, either their own inner feelings or your feelings, the feelings of another. 3, there must be a willingness to engage in meaningful, ongoing, and sustained self-reflection. And finally, 4, over time, they have to begin to form genuine reciprocal connections. I wanted to clarify this now so you have the full context as we dive deeper into the conversation. If you find this clip interesting and you want to hear the entire interview, head over to Valerie's podcast. I'll include the link in the show notes below. As always, if you have any questions for me, feel free to reach out. I would love to hear from you. Okay, without further ado, here's the final clip of my interview with Valerie. I hope you enjoy it.
I'm curious, does the person I know have these 4 characteristics that you mentioned that allow change to happen?
Right.
And if you notice that they do, the question is, how might you be able to influence them to seek help?
If you notice that they have this capacity, you mean, like they meet the criteria you're saying, right? So it's a positive prognostic sign at that moment.
Yeah.
That's going to be tough because if they're actually hitting these markers, what's the incentive to go get help?
Mm-hmm.
Right? I would be more inclined if they're struggling. Like if you notice within them and your partner or whomever, or yourself, by the way, are prone to return to that shared fantasy, that shared unconscious fantasy where things are just amazing and you see these cycles of idealization and then the devaluation, loss is difficult, then you could say, yes, maybe, look, we tried and we put up a good effort and we got so far, but maybe now it's time for professional assistance. Yeah.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I mean, I'll talk about this too when I talk about healing codependence, but if a codependent is in relationship with a narcissist who they think might be capable of change, it's really about the codependent doing their inner work to be vulnerable to themselves and recognizing what they need and being able to spell that out. Here's what I need. Here's what it would provide for me. And having healthy boundaries. These are the boundaries I need to set. This is what I'm comfortable giving. This is what I'm not comfortable giving. And set those limits. And that I want to be with you, but I can't be with you unless these things change. And to be able to tolerate the potential rage that can come and stay true to your boundaries in a loving, compassionate, empathic way, which is really, really hard because what that requires is to heal codependence before we can do that. And so, of course, that's what I'll talk about in our interview of me.
Yeah. It's interesting because when you just talked it out, you made me think about when you asked, like, how can you talk to somebody about getting help? And one way I thought now, which I didn't think of before, is to couch it as not that this is your problem, right? Like that I need you to do this, because once you do that, you're pathologizing them.
Right.
I would try to couch it more like, do you think this is a problem? Like I would always try to engage their curiosity and get their buy-in. And it wouldn't be a recommendation, you see, because once you recommend somebody to go get help, especially if someone's narcissistically vulnerable,
Yep.
they're going to feel pathologized so quickly, and then they're going to push back on you.
Yep.
So the question is, can you engage their curiosity and help them begin to see that maybe they are in conflict themselves? Like, in other words, they really want to change. They recognize the relationship isn't going well, or they recognize that they have these bouts of insecurity, that they feel great one moment and the next moment they're desperately insecure. You can then talk to them about, do you think, that this is creating a problem in your life? Or how is it you manage these things? Do you think it would be helpful to have somebody manage them with you, or to help you give you some tools to help you manage it? Because you really seem to be suffering when you're crying and you're in bed for like half a day when you break down. It's so painful to see you this way.
Yeah, no,
So
exactly.
that's one way then. Yeah. So to get their buy-in by way of helping them begin to reflect upon, right, whether this is interfering in their relationships, their work, whatever it is where it may be interfering.
Right. No, exactly. I love what you just said because it's really about authentically being compassionately curious. You're not trying to change them.
Yes, that's right.
You're not judging them. And what that requires is if we're codependent, codependents also can't recognize that the other person has separate feelings and needs that are okay. Like they have a belief that if you're not okay, I'm not okay.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like I need to be having self-compassion for my feelings and needs and having compassion for your feelings and needs in order to be authentically curious.
Yes.
So
Yeah, that's a high level of and it's interesting. Again, you get me thinking when you say this, because oftentimes one of the things I talk about with the vulnerable narcissist is the way they're so dependent and needy and clingy. And I talk to people, and I've done this on during other interviews, is how it's so important to contain that. In other words, don't just gratify their needs, and don't get angry with them and tell them they're pathetic and they need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, right? But then sometimes I get a little pushback, like that takes a really high level of maturity to be able to contain that. And I agree, it absolutely does, because if you're in a dysregulated state of mind yourself, how could you possibly feel compassion and understanding for somebody, who's in this state? But that goes back to codependency, because that implies you're mixed up in it with them. There's no separation. In other words, their problem is your problem.
right.
So when they have a problem, how could you talk to them if you're dysregulated? But now, according to the codependency theory, which we need to get much further into, and I'm looking forward to this, is you may already be in a codependent relationship, and that's why you're not in a position to just be more empathic and understanding and contain their feelings.
Right, exactly. And it has to start with being compassionate and empathic and understanding of our own feelings.
Yes. Yeah. And
like otherwise we're just going to get enmeshed with them drawing us into their victim story and want to help them and be people pleasing. And that is still
a big part. That's a big part of narcissism, which I didn't talk about when we were going over the descriptive criteria.
Right.
But there's this inordinate need to please others as well. That you have that sort of segment or cluster of narcissism. But that too leads to a false relationship. That's the shared fantasy as well, because if you please them, again, you feel so good because then you're getting the recognition that you so desire and need.
Mm-hmm.
But it's still not an authentic relationship. Of course not. So all of this is part of what leads to change, or what's necessary for change, is recognizing what we could call a split world, right? There's this fantasy world, the shared unconscious fantasy, where you're striving for everything to be so blissful. That's the symbiotic union, right? That's finally feeling recognized, right? And that world is so appealing. It's like a drug, it's like an addiction. So there's that world. And then there's the real world, which sucks, by the way. It's not pleasant. People have different opinions. There are people who frustrate you, right? People who don't gratify your needs immediately. And this is the conflict. And this is part of the work, by the way, that I do with these patients, is helping them, show them specifically when they slip out of the real world into the fantasy world. Because again, since it's unconscious, right, Valerie, you said this earlier, which was an important point. They don't even recognize it. And if you don't recognize something, how could you possibly ever begin to work on it?
Yep.
So what I could show them slowly over time, like I'll just give you like a little example. Like if someone comes in and they're complaining about, I don't know, my husband and I had a fight over child rearing, right? That he had this different opinion and it led to this argument. If I'm able to slow that story down and show her what happened, and I'll say, listen, can we go back for a moment? I don't know if you noticed this, but you were telling me about a fight that you had with your husband, and you seemed quite uncomfortable that he had a different opinion. See, so there's the difference, right? But then you shifted and you started, and now here you could fill in the blank, because some people go to fighting, like I mentioned earlier, or everything is wonderful. So I'll say, did you notice that you shifted and you started telling me what an amazing weekend you had with him, or you attacked him, or whatever, right? So the goal then is to begin to show them these minute shifts from a painful reality that your husband had a different opinion on child rearing. Because most people who are not personality disordered would be like, of course you have a different opinion. I didn't expect you to be a carbon copy of me. And let me hear your opinion. What were you thinking? But for someone who has the personality disorder, there's that separation that I mentioned earlier that's so subtle they don't even notice and so unbearable. And they slip back in order to undo it into the fantasy of like, let me just tell you about the amazing weekend we had. And then I could empathize with that and say, look, I could see how that made you feel better. It's much more pleasant to be thinking about the amazing weekend rather than the difference of opinions, right? So now then we could get her curious, hopefully, about, but is there any other way, perhaps, that you could feel better about a different opinion? Can we talk about that? So that's a small piece, because like we said, there are so many different things going on, with these personalities. But that's one small piece in terms of how we address splitting, right? How we address the fragmented sense of self, how we help them become more integrated, and how we help them begin to realize that they exist in two separate worlds, the fantasy world and the world of reality, because they do exist in both. When these people go on, tirades about how, they're the devil and the narcissist is the worst and they'll never change. By the way, that's splitting as well, just so you know, right? Because now you're just attacking somebody and you're not looking at the complete person anymore. So the goal is integration and helping them recognize feelings that they couldn't tolerate. So some people call it expanding their self-awareness, but that's what we're doing, basically.
Right.
Yeah.
No, exactly. I love that little story because I think it really emphasizes how slow the work needs to go.
Yes.
We slip into this and, because codependents do it too. We slip into these fantasies to escape feeling painful feelings in the moment. And the corrective experience is learning how to have self-compassion and self-empathy for our feelings in the moment. But that's really slow work. We have to slow down. Have you seen people transform their relationship dynamics then, that like they can actually slowly be more authentic with each other and that they can make it work better?
Yeah, of course. I mean, when you start relating to people in the world of what we call in my field whole objects instead of part objects, in other words, people are not just there to gratify your needs, right? Yeah, the relationship changes. So the more they become aware of this, the more compassion they begin to develop. That's empathy. And everybody will say that the narcissist doesn't have a capacity for empathy, but that's not true. And they call it fake empathy. I think you even use that. Maybe initially it's fake. But I'd rather have fake empathy, by the way, than someone raging at me. Sure. I'd rather have them pretending that they care and at least trying to think about how I feel, when they do X or Y. But typically, if things go accordingly, if you have those criteria that they're there, they're working at it, it's long enough, a sustained effort, yeah, of course we see change. And it's not just me, by the way. I'm not just saying this anecdotally. There's good research studies out there, randomized controlled trials, which is the gold standard, that study this stuff, and they look at change, and they show it as well. So that's not just coming from me and in my practice in terms of what I see. But there's evidence to suggest that these people do have a capacity to change.
Yeah. It's such a tough question, so I appreciate you covering this topic, because the other things that we could cover, that we talked about that we could cover, it could take a whole separate interview. But,
Yes.
because now that we know that it's possible to change, it's really hard to make the call. How do you know if the person can change, if they can be inspired to go to therapy, either individually or with you, or if it's time to leave? And you've started to talk about why it's so difficult to leave, but we can elaborate on that dynamic. And
yes, and what happens when you do leave, and how do you begin to live a life separate from them? Because remember the shared unconscious fantasy. You were there for good reason yourself, as painful as it was. So what does life look like now that you left? And can you really move forward in life? Because some people leave, but they never really move forward.
Exactly. And so if you're in that state, then of course, Dr. Anthony Mazzella works with people that are in relationship with narcissists as well to help them figure that out. So we'll ask, when I post this interview, I'm asking in the comments, do you want me to bring Dr. Anthony Mazzella back to answer those questions in a second interview? Because I think that those are very useful topics and we could definitely cover that. But regardless, while we're waiting to figure that out, I encourage everybody to reach out to Dr. Mazzella if you sense that you might either be on the NPD spectrum yourself, or if you're in a relationship with somebody who you sense might be, to figure out what your options even are. So let's talk about how people can get in touch with you.
Well, great. Yeah. I mean, everything's on my website, just to keep it simple. My podcast is there, the video channel's there, any blogs that I write, articles that I've published. It's all at drmazzella.com. You'll put it below, so I won't go into the details here. But you can look me up on my website. And Valerie, if your audience votes in favor of me coming back, I just want to say I would love to come back. I'm happy. I really enjoyed this conversation. It was so stimulating and insightful. I love your feedback, and I'm really looking forward. We're not calling it part 2. We're just calling it another interview. So I just want to remind everybody, we're going over to my channel next, and we're going to look at Valerie's area, right, of specialties, which is what? Codependency, right?
Yes.
Disclaimer alert. The Narcissism Decoder podcast is provided for general information purposes only. The content presented in this podcast is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any psychological condition related to narcissism. The content on this podcast should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. For specific advice pertaining to narcissism or any other psychological condition, you could reach me directly. I am an experienced mental health practitioner who is always taking on new patients. If you would just like a consultation, I can do that too.